there's no fraud agencies. There's a lot of concurrent jurisdiction. That's why there's 6 or 7 different places you can file a fraud complaint. Some of them consolidate those complaints, other ones don't. That's why you're saying there's not a great stat on what the true number is. And if you send your complaint to a place that, oh, that's not my job, is it their job to then forward it to the agency that is? So that's kind of an area, especially with local reporting. Like it can be very difficult if they don't have a roadmap or there isn't someone holding them accountable.
This is Converge, a podcast from Convera. Come with us as we shape the future of finance.
Welcome back to Converge, day 2 at Money 2020. Excited to have 3 wonderful guests who are fresh off a stage panel today. This is the recording live from the show floor once again. And I'm joined by Karen Boyer, the SVP and Director of Fraud Intelligence with M&T Bank, David Maimon, Head of Fraud Insights with SentiLink, and Natalie Loebner, owner of Loebner Consulting. Great to have all of you. Thanks so much for taking time out of your hectic schedule here. Your panel discussion on stage earlier was focused on society's need for what you call a fraud czar. It's a bold statement. Can you each tell us what led you to this conclusion for this need? What experiences have you had that highlight the critical need for a czar of fraud? Why don't we start with Karen?
Yeah. So it's funny. I've actually had this concept in my head for quite some time that U.S. government in general is a bit disjointed with initiatives of not only fraud protection, scam detection, liability conversations, but also outdated regulations that were built 20, 30 years ago that have no kind of correspondence to the type of faster payments and digital payments that we're dealing with now. I was speaking with David a few months ago, probably a year ago now, and he referenced saw something actually in a LinkedIn post, and he was like, "Oh, we need a fraud." I'm like, "That's what it's called." And I mean, czar is a pretty cool word. Let's just call it what it is. So yeah. So I mean, instead of like a body of government, let's czar it out. Yeah. So that's where my opinion of some sort of body of empowerment that is not only helpful in attempting to solve probably these fraud problems for our ecosystem in the U.S., but also just the awareness that to kind of bridge our silos, if you will.
That's good. Well, since we have so many questions, Natalie, let's talk a little bit about your background. It's really interesting. Maths and federal litigation. Great combo. How did that unusual combination lead you to a career fighting fin crime? And what unique perspective do you bring to the fight against fraud, particularly in the world of data analysis and investigation?
So a lot of kind of the career trajectory is I'm a military spouse, so we moved a lot, and I just chose to have a job that's available as opposed to in front of me. But yeah, I have my background in undergrad was mathematical modeling. I started out doing more scientific research, but a law firm in the early 2000s had a really big data set of evidence, and I basically was data mining for case evidence, and that sparked my interest in being a lawyer. And it didn't really matter whether I was doing healthcare fraud, bankruptcy, tax, anti-money laundering, asset forfeiture, the ability to join information, understand, simple things like a VLOOKUP or primary keys when getting discovery from different institutions. What has become more and more critical as we're trying to link chatter on the dark web, text messages, social media, financial transactions, GPS. If we're trying to prove a case, those are all now the story pieces, not so much testimony, and we still need that, but it's very critical for a lot of this online financial crime. And so it's just where there's a gap, you just start filling it. Yeah, but yeah. I'm often more of a translator between law and more analyst people.
Cool. David, SentiLink focuses on synthetic fraud. For our listeners who may not be that familiar with this type, can you explain how that works and why is it such a challenging area to address, and how does SentiLink use tech to combat synthetic fraud?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. But before I do that, I would like to sort of talk a little bit about the concept of fraudsters as well.
By all means.
I didn't have a chance to do it over the stage, but I think it's important to sort of make sure that people understand what we have in mind, right? The concept is important. We don't know whether we are talking about an agency or talking about a person who, at the end of the day, will be the point where all the data goes to, and the person who will go and sort of advocate for regulation changes and education and research and things of that nature. But the concept is important because what we're seeing right now in the ecosystem is a lot of people trying to prevent and mitigate fraud, and by doing this solely on their platform, opening the door for fraud on a different platform. You sort of close the door in one place, you get the fraud from the window. And we see that a lot in the context of fraud against the government, fraud against the banks, fraud against individuals. And to me, when I was discussing this with Karen, what was missing is someone who essentially sits out there and have a more comprehensive sort of thinking about this, trying to connect the dots. Karen's banks, you guys are doing whatever you're doing. The government does whatever the government does. But at the end of the day, nobody really takes into consideration, the entire ecosystem and try to prevent and disrupt in a way that makes sense. And so in this sense, the concept of fraudster really came to mind. Simply an agency or a person or an entity, which will be able to sort of tie all the loose nodes, make sure we're bringing all the relevant data together, make sure that we run educational program in a way that makes sense to engage in specific research that will push the envelope forward. And I think this entity we're discussing is potentially could be responsible for that. Now, in the context of synthetic identities and SentiLink, our company is very important in the context of identifying synthetic identities. Synthetic identities are essentially fake identities. We differentiate between first-party and third-party synthetics. First-party synthetics are essentially me taking my own name and then taking Karen or Natalie's social security number and then using this information in order to engage in fraud. On the other hand, third-party fraud is just me making up an identity completely, starting with a name, going to the date of birth and social security, and then grooming that. And so what SentiLink does, and this is very relevant to our conversation in the context of fraudster, is to identify synthetic fraud, is analyze all these databases and create those machine learning models in order to detect whether you are a real person or you're not. And so when we do that, we manufacture a risk score. We produce a risk score, which ranges between 0 to 1,000. The higher the score is, the higher the probability that the identity you're dealing with and that you're trying to verify on your platform is synthetic. So hopefully that answered the question.
It does. Thank you. Karen, your extensive experience at M&T Bank gives you sort of a front row seat to the evolving tactics of fraudsters out there. What are some of the most alarming trends you're currently seeing in financial crime? How are criminals adapting to new technologies and consumer behaviors? Obviously, synthetic fraud is sort of one way, but what are you seeing from the bank side?
Yeah, well, for years, banks have been very much focused on understanding and technological advances of detecting, is it me logging into my account or is it somebody else? Fraudsters never stopped or quickly adapted to, well, obviously banks have this technology, so the weakest link is the human. So let me coach somebody to make the APP push payment authorization type of fraud. That's something we've been dealing with. It's not really in the front line, but just a couple of years now is understanding you can't, as David said, you can never stop monitoring for the old fraud. And so that's still, account takeover still here. But now we still have to understand, well, how are we going to detect when it's the real customer that's being logged in doing that transaction? But even more so, what's the intent of the payment? And even on top of that, are they being coached? And what is the behavioral differential of when that person typically makes a Zelle payment compared to this time? Now, as far as the front line and what kind of keeps me up at night, with that said, fraud as a service and the complete scaling and exponential access or fraudsters for Telegram, for example. I mean, but it's on Facebook or Meta, sorry, not Twitter or X, whatever they're calling themselves this week. But every single social media, like I was referencing before, like it's not just dark net anymore. This is completely just an app on the phone, and you can just not only can you figure out buy services of people to teach you how to perform fraud, but you could just pay somebody to do the fraud for you. So that's something we're dealing with consistently. And I know David's been fantastic, like bringing that to light. Now, mixing that with AI, you can't go to Money 2020 without talking about AI, right?
Nope.
But generative AI in general, like in the fraud world, we've been using AI for over 10 years. But the amount of generative AI, deep fake technology that is being used for scams is becoming more and more prevalent. I think that in general, people are thinking generative AI, we're going to, talk about synthetic identities. People are going to bypass selfie likeness, and that's completely happening, sure.
Yeah.
But it's the amount of deep fake technology that's being used on the other end to scam our customers is something that needs to be considered. Like, for example, like we used to always talk our customers off the edge, and one of the main questions is, well, I know that he's your fiance, but have you ever met him? And how have you ever seen him? And then that was kind of like, the clicking point, like, oh my God, maybe I am being scammed. Right now, the answer is, oh yeah, we FaceTime every day. But unfortunately, that FaceTime is just whoever they're attempting to look at through different tools. So that's the forefront of what we're dealing with. Scam awareness. But also, the whispers of the liability shift of bank to bank of who's going to pay when this happens, without the understanding that this is a broader ecosystem scenario, bringing it back to FraudStar. It's not about who's paying the claim. It's about how is this starting and how can we stop it from starting in the first.
Yeah.
I think you guys are dealing also with the fact that this is not only all over the place and you can purchase it. It's also the fact that everybody wants to do that. I mean, you have kids on social media wanting to do fraud. That is a huge challenge that the banks, the government, the healthcare system, they're all facing simply because everybody wants to engage in fraud.
Right.
And it makes sense, right? I mean, why wouldn't you do that? Detection is relatively low. The
payout's big.
Exactly, and fraud is perceived to be part of the cost of doing business. So why not? And that is, I think, the major thing that you guys are experiencing as well.
And it's so hard too, because when it happens, right? Like, where does a customer go? Is fraud, if you had drugs involved or gun, there's two different agencies. Like, there's no fraud agencies. There's a lot of concurrent jurisdiction. That's why there's 6 or 7 different places you can file a fraud complaint. Some of them consolidate those complaints. Other ones don't. That's why you're saying there's not a great stat on what the true number is. And if you send your complaint to a place that, oh, that's not my job, is it their job to then forward it to the agency that is? So that's kind of an area, especially with local reporting. Like, it can be very difficult if they don't have a roadmap or there isn't someone holding them accountable to be doing that information sharing. Many are trying, but it's hard without dedicated funding and someone to have a coherent and vision, but also the responsibility to get it done. And that doesn't exist right now.
Yeah. So you've spoken now of the pieces that make up this web of online fraud that you mentioned in your session description. Karen, you've spoken about how cyber vulnerabilities are used to exploit consumers. Can you expand on that web of online fraud, but not just who the key players are, but who enable the key players in the web of fraud to be able to do what they do? I mean, we're talking about social media fraud, whatever it may be. Who are the key enablers that empower fraudsters to be able to get away with those tactics?
That's a big question. Themselves, as David was referencing, the fact that you can download an app on your phone with a number, nothing else, and you could be part of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of forums that how do you DDoS a bank? How do you that bot OTP, or if I'm not saying that one right, but DDoSing OTPs, intercepting them for multi-factor, creating synthetic identities, hiring somebody to bypass liveliness check. It's all there. On top of it, talk about synthetic identities in general, something that we didn't touch on is like business synthetic identities. Business identity theft is becoming one of the largest loss categories, and wrapping that up into check fraud, but still, I mean, check fraud is the giant problem. Mail theft, they're intercepting very large checks payable to corporations. I did a presentation the other day, and David has been shouting this from the rooftops. Gary Warner had a great example. Somebody in Georgia registered AWS, Amazon Web Services LLC, or Amazon LLC. I mean, the fact that all you need is, I think, $35 per the state to register a business, depending on what state it is, but nonetheless, and then you get an EIN number because the state registration works. And so that's another thing that we're dealing with is the synthetic business and business identity theft and business impersonation. And back to kind of empowering a fraud czar, who's monitoring the state to register those businesses to say, well, time out, let's have some common sense here. Some guy from Georgia is not necessarily going to own Amazon. But this is what we're dealing with. And they're passing all authentication and KYC, KYB, because they got their articles of incorporation and they got all the documents that prove they're a business. And it's not until the transactions start occurring. And again, Amazon is an easy one. There was another one, Bazooka was in the Bazooka Inc. Yeah, Bazooka. So, and then there's actually Bazooka 0, Bazooka 1, Bazooka 2. So clearly they're shell companies that were set up for more checks. I use an example I had even back 2 years ago, American Express LLC. It's still registered out of the Bronx. But those are the things that, like, it's easy to get those. But what if it's like, Natalie Loebner Consulting LLC versus Inc. And I'm getting a little bit off on trail, so I apologize.
I mean, I can kind of pull on that a little bit too, where because we don't have a very coordinated form to say, tell me the facts about what's going on, it's very hard to say, is this a one-off teenager or person scamming that is a really good case for local law enforcement, or are they perpetrating it online and you can find connected digital footprints to say, oh, this should go to Secret Service or FBI, depending on who's got the specialty or the domain there, or is it international and we need to pull in partners? And because there isn't one portal to put these complaints in, there isn't a coherent way to analyze it, there isn't education to the public sector about what, this future state portal would need, it's hard to triage what's going on and know how to assign the information, because some of the, I don't know if you're calling it typologies or flavors of fraud, they're very different from a treatment perspective from law enforcement. Who's going to deal with it, whose job it is, because there's concurrent jurisdiction across the government, and the federal government doesn't mandate state rights. So some of that, what you're talking about, is huge policy shifts. Is there absolute freedom of speech online? I mean, you can live action role play as a fraudster, and it's not a crime up until the crime is committed. So there's some very deep policy questions to very rational issues that I think is like particularly American in its own way.
I think in the context of enablers, I mean, it's really all of the above, right? I mean, it's the government, it's law enforcement, banks, it's the companies out there who are, at the end of the day, purchasing all those technologies. And at the end of the day, we don't really know what works and what doesn't. Then you have those people, those kids. We're seeing people flashing a lot of money on social media. They want in. And that's play a very important role in it. So,
scam compounds, offshore, like massive, like businesses, essentially.
When I talk about fraud, I talk a lot about it. The question I ask my fraud fighter colleagues is, why aren't you doing this? I mean, the incentives are there for you to do that, not for you to fight it.
You mean to do fraud?
Yeah. Why aren't you doing it, right? I mean,
I don't
if you think
well
about detection, well, we can try and help you with that problem, right?
How you cooperate, but not how you do fraud yourself. But how do you cooperate? I mean, that's the question. How do you actually coordinate a response? I think you touched on that, Natalie, about the difficulty of coordinating the response. But I mean, who wants to take a stab at how you can better coordinate those responses between your different?
So I think the frauds our entity potentially can bring in all those databases together, bringing all the technology we need, put together some standards around how we should what should we qualify and think about as fraud. A lot of research that we need to do. I mean, I think that entity definitely should guide that. A lot of education. And we talk about it, and we talk about this with other partners as well, about the fact that education, like fraud-related education, is great, but we need more of it. We need to make sure that we have some kind of a lighthouse, sort of speaking, telling us, okay, this is happening right now. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. I mean, we don't have anyone telling us in real time, hey, this is happening. I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to push a lot in 2020 is the issue of PPP fraud and SBA loan fraud and then check fraud. And I felt at the time that I'm, the only person who's talking about it. We got a lot of pushback from the government, from the bank, right? And I think this entity should bring and tie all those nodes together and then essentially support the ecosystem and try to help us all prevent and mitigate fraud in a more efficient way.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like in a practical sense, the first mover, if they were willing, would be a private sector, an industry group. Those are things that the coalition of the willing can start tomorrow. A fraud czar could be, put in place with an executive order. It doesn't necessarily require, it does need some funding, but to have an agency, I mean, that's something that you're planning like 5-10 years down the road. So there's steps that, to start now. Who's able to act quickly is generally private sector, can be a first actor, but to make the government have a coordinated role, you do need someone with the responsibility and the authority within the government, but that can come in a number of different tails. So in my mind, like there's not one way to do it,
Yeah, I agree.
but we cannot keep waiting to take whatever that first step is.
Yeah.
So given the the idea of a fraud czar being a centralized authority, what are talk about the downsides potentially to such a model? Could it have a sort of a backfiring effect of stifling innovation or creating unintended consequences? What alternative approaches could you consider if those were there? And do you see any of those downsides being part of the picture?
I have a quick response on you guys. So I think it's more about who's at the table and has a good voice. Like I was saying on the stage, like I have been listening and hearing to like consumer protection, industry, government, and hearing a lot of valid issues, but I don't think having a sort of even keeled risk manager there. And so I think there are risks if it's just the banks or it's just consumer protection or it's just this or just that. There can be very difficult consequences that are bad. And so you do need some sort of almost like audit or oversight that they're accountable to these different stakeholders. I think that could be, again, I think the government is kind of one that can push that because if it's privately funded, there's always some sort of motivator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about the stifling innovation scenario. I think it's making innovation safer because I think the problem we have is our main goal in the U.S. is innovative, faster payments, larger, faster payments, and back to just Czar. There, I mean, David, you talked about PPP. Call a spade a spade. Like there was nobody to say, oh, maybe we should have some authentication on this instead of a consent checkbox that says, yes, I have, 10 employees and I deserve this money. That's something that like is, in my opinion, would be an exact empowerment of this. And it's not facetious to think about this. I mean, other government agencies across the pond are looking and have some sort of foundation like this built, or at least they're in its infancy. But back to kind of Natalie's point, it's about having the right people at the table because here we are, even on the government side, we have the Stop Scams Act, but it's really like Make the Banks Pay Act, and there's nobody that's like kind of making that a broader statement of the ecosystem. Well, how are we going to stop scams? And on the private side, for banks in general, we're kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place because were consistently misconceived that like banks aren't doing anything for scams. We don't call that's absolutely not true. But at the same time, we have on the BSA side, we are regulated. I'm not saying regulations the answer, but you're regulated to stop suspicious money movement. You're regulated to look for these transactions. You're regulated to take some sort of action. And and if it's not facetious for fraud to be part of that, so not to stop innovation, but but to understand the risks that are associated when like generative AI, just like like kind of out in the wild, and it talks about regulation and how to make sure that it's not being used for nefarious activities. But again, here we are. There's talks. It's talks. And so similarly, I just think I don't see downside. And, I'm just such a positive person. But
We like that.
I just think that it's to do it right and to get everybody at the table.
I think in terms of challenges, I mean, we are talking about an enormous effort. A lot of different entities needs to play ball together.
Yeah.
That's a huge challenge. The FI, law enforcement, academia, government, you bring everyone together with their own perspective, with their own ideas. Even fintech companies and financial institutions data and government data, and put it all together. It's just an enormous effort that needs to happen. That's one of the major challenges out there. Making sure people talk the same language, I think that is also key, and that's a huge potential deal breaker. We had several conversations before the panel where we felt like we had to sort of make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to what do we mean by fraud, right? We had to define it for ourselves, right? And so just imagine those huge entities out there needing to put some thoughts around it, right? So these are the major challenges that I think that potentially could derail this effort.
Yeah.
Well, and even like you're talking about getting whipsaw from the government in a way where you have different agencies that have their own mission, and you're hearing two different things, and so that's part of where a government entity says, no, this is the message, and they're reconciling, because you almost need an insider to hear the government perspective to then come to the private sector, because especially law enforcement, we can't disclose a lot of active stuff, and they need a sounding board that's trusted before they can do a message or an opinion.
This is all great. We've gone off script, so I'm gonna winnow down the last couple of questions to just two more. If you look beyond the United States, are there any international models or initiatives that are providing a model for a fraud czar or something the like that inspire you, that at least inspire progress towards this vision for the U.S.?
I'll start. I
know what you want to say, so go ahead.
I love Australia. They
Aren't
have
we
great
all, right?
accents.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Down under and everything. Shrimp on the ball bay. But they seem to be, in my opinion, my own personal opinion, just industry wise, but their scope of they're not focusing on liability payment. They're focusing on root cause and of the scams, and having some sort of accountability, policies and standards and accountability for every industry, if you will, that's involved in the ecosystem that is allowing scams to proliferate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my short answer.
I mean, I think it's an interesting. I was talking with someone from an Australian bank yesterday, actually, about it. Talking about implementing 48-hour holds and these other kinds of things they're able to do. However, was it Australia has under 10 major banks, and they have a much smaller population, and they're able to, like, their telecoms can turn off links. They have different kind of surveillance and partnership. So I see it almost as a pilot for the United States, and we'd have to be very mindful about how do you scale that to like almost the enterprise level, which would be what we're dealing with here. And scaling solutions doesn't always work. And so I'm very excited about it. I agree with Karen that it's very comprehensive and it's looking broadly. But I'm also, just like really curious about how it's going to play out and how it can be applied.
Yeah, there's really no evidence for the Australian model, as you and I talk a lot about, is still theoretical. They came up with this huge document and now they want to implement it. So good luck with that, first of all. But the important thing to understand, as Natalie said, that we're talking about scale issue, right? I mean, another very important thing that we need to bring to mind is culture. Think about the Chinese. I mean, how about the way they're dealing with fraud? Isn't it great? you know. So I think in the context of the Chinese, right, the Russian, and the way they're dealing with fraud, it's also really interesting. But the question is whether we want to do things the way they do, right? I mean, we're a democracy. I mean, they're obviously not. So that is a very important factor that we need to take into consideration as well. So when you ask this question, I mean, I can tell you from my experience and from my reading and sort of engaging in fraud prevention, I don't see anyone at this point doing fraud prevention in a perfect way, so to speak. I don't have any model I can rely on and say, this is how we should do things. Simply because, we're in the United States, right? I mean, we're very unique. Like the Chinese are very unique. The Russians are very unique. The North Korean are very, very unique, right? So, we need to take that in consideration where we try to sort of import other models, which maybe or maybe not work in other places.
One note to that is you were referencing the cultural
Exactly, yeah.
change. U.S. is so customer centric, and so that's part of the, at least in my opinion, that we could help with the empowerment of, like Natalie, as you referenced. Like, does it make sense that somebody who's 83 is sending $1 million wire? No, it doesn't really make that sense. But like, shame on us if we stop it and it's real. And but at the same time, if we say, hey, I think that this is fraudulent, and the customer's like, no, it's real, and then come back and then all of a sudden it was fraudulent, then that's a headline. And so that's part of, in my opinion, I would love to have an oversight kind of body as somebody who's on the field for fraud prevention, to say, no, we're allowed to stop this because there's guidance and policies and standards to say that this is the expectation of stopping fraud. Similar to CISA, I know we talked about it. It's policies and standards of an oversight with the expectations of this is what you're allowed to do. Maybe not so granular, but to give the comfortability and support that we're doing it for the good of the ecosystem, and it's not a customer friction type of mentality.
Sweet. Great. Okay. Well, that was a long one, but still not as long as I had planned, which is good. Natalie, Karen, David, thanks so much. Great to chat with you all, and best of luck for the rest of the conference. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Pleasure.